Hi, good day to you. Welcome to another episode of ASEAN Kita, where we will unravel some obscure issues related to ASEAN, and we will also explore some unique and diverse cultures of some of the ASEAN nations. But for this particular episode, Amirul, as we look towards Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship in 2025, the dynamics of our regional partnerships take on even greater significance. One such partnership is with Australia, which has played a pivotal role in ASEAN's journey since becoming its first dialogue partner back in 1974. And over the decades, the ASEAN-Australia relationship has grown to encompass wide-ranging cooperation across ASEAN's three pillars, which are political security, economic, and also socio-cultural.
So today we are honored to have Dr. John Lee, and he's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and also was a former senior advisor to the Australian Foreign Minister. Dr. Lee has extensive knowledge on the economics advance of Asia-Pacific regions and specific focus on ASEAN and China of Australia's relationship with the Southeast Asia region. And his insights into trade, geopolitics, and also regional stability are highly sought after, and which makes him a perfect guest in ASEAN Kita, Farhan.
Definitely.
So welcome to the show, Dr. Lee. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
All right. Dr. Lee, so the first question is, Australia has become ASEAN's first dialogue partner in 1974, and making it the beginning of a formal relationship aimed at fostering economic and political and also cultural ties. So this partnership was initially motivated by regional security and also concerns during the Cold War, and has evolved significantly over the decades. So what are the key areas of cooperation between Australia and ASEAN since it's become ASEAN's first dialogue in 1974, Dr. Lee?
If you look at why Australia became the first dialogue partner, Australia emerged after World War II. Its traditional economic partners, the United Kingdom and also the United States, they were still important, but geography is permanent. And Australia realised that it was in the Asian region. So it had to find its way in the Asian region. Now, Australia is a large continent, but it's a small population. So if we want to be prosperous, we need trade. We need to sell things around the world and to Asia. And it became apparent then, and it's apparent now, that if there is instability in Southeast Asia, we cannot be prosperous because most of our trade goes through Southeast Asia. In fact, almost all of our trade goes through Southeast Asia. In ASEAN, our leaders back then, I think they realised that ASEAN was there to maintain the peace and the rivalry between the ASEAN countries, to maintain the rivalries and make sure they were under control. So Australia supported the mission of ASEAN right from the beginning. Now, since then, Australia's role with ASEAN and in Southeast Asia more broadly, it's not just trade. Australia is a very important development partner. It's quite a strong champion for ASEAN to a lot of our traditional allies, the United States, United Kingdom, and it now encompasses a lot of educational links, a lot of people-to-people links. I think the business-to-business links between Australia and Southeast Asia is still underdone, and I think there's a lot more potential there. So looking ahead in the future, Australia, not just through ASEAN, but ASEAN will be important for Australia to increase our people-to-people and business-to-business links in Southeast Asia, not just in Northeast Asia.
Well, Australia's partnership with ASEAN has also evolved to the level of a comprehensive strategic partner in 2021. As a comprehensive strategic partner, how has Australia demonstrated some of tangible progress in addressing ASEAN's regional challenges, such as economic inequality and security threats, such as the current ones? The most fractious thing about Malaysia and some of ASEAN nations with China is when it comes to the South China Sea. They want to be seen as a new leader in the region. So how does Australia demonstrated and address these problems?
In my view, Australia has quite a realistic view of ASEAN and ASEAN's role. And what I mean by that is, on the one hand, Australian leaders have consistently reaffirmed ASEAN centrality. And what that means in my mind, and I think in the Australian mind, is that ASEAN is well placed to lead the regional conversations about strategic affairs. ASEAN is centrally placed to be the host of discussions and forums, not just with ASEAN states, but between the great powers and between the Chinese, the Americans, the Japanese, and also the claimant states. So from that point of view, on the one hand, Australia has recognised that ASEAN has this central diplomatic role to play. On the other hand, in my view, Australia is also realistic that ASEAN is composed of 10 member states. Those member states have different interests. So therefore, when it comes to geostrategy or geopolitics, the member states within ASEAN themselves have quite different interests, or at least approaches. And therefore, ASEAN as such is not a strategic actor. It is more an entity to bring the relevant players together. That doesn't mean that problems will be solved or easily solved, but it is an important step to at least get the right voices in the room to discuss these issues. So I think that's Australia's view of the role of ASEAN and ASEAN centrality.
Dr. Lee, given the emphasis on mutual trust and also shared interests, how does or how should Australia navigate potential conflict of interest within the member states of ASEAN, particularly when member states have differing stances on major geopolitical issues like the China's and US rivalry? So we have Philippines, who are very vocal against China, and also we have Vietnam, who has contentious history with the China. So thoughts, Dr. Lee?
I begin with the proposition that China is an essential part of the region, that the mutual prosperity of Asia cannot continue without China being a central part of that. However, my view is also that China is a very ambitious and in some respects quite a revisionist power when it comes to changing some of the status quo in the region. So the key question is, how do we manage that? Now, with the ASEAN nations, as you mentioned, they all have different approaches and also have different histories, geographies, but also relationships. So Philippines, a treaty ally, and as we all know, the Philippines has re-emphasized its alliance with the United States. This is in contrast to other countries that are not formal treaty allies like Malaysia. My personal view is that countries can play different roles in keeping the peace. So, for example, I wouldn't expect Malaysia to take the same, you might say, confrontational attitude to China in the South China Sea. But Philippines, in taking this role and working with the Americans, and I would say also the Australians and Japanese, that does create some reassuring constraints on the Chinese. And in a sense, countries like Malaysia and other countries like Thailand and Indonesia, they can play a more middle role because other countries take those risks to put some constraints on Chinese behavior. Now, none of this works perfectly or smoothly, but I suppose my point is that I believe countries within Southeast Asia, within the ASEAN setup, can play different roles to ensure ultimately stability and continued prosperity.
What are those roles?
Well, international politics is a mixture of diplomacy, but also of balancing and hard power. So my view of the region is that countries like Japan, Australia, Philippines, but possibly South Korea, as well as the United States, plays the more balancing hard power roles. But there are other countries, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, perhaps Singapore, who can play a more middling diplomatic role. And those things will not ever perfectly align, but all those countries play their own individual roles based on their own history and based on their own capabilities to ensure that differences never get out of hand. So I value the role of the Philippines, but I also value the role of countries like Malaysia, who also try to play a mediating or middle role in the region given these difficult disagreements.
Well, considering the shifting global power dynamics, you know, back in the past we regard US as the main superpower, but now it's shifting to China. And, you know, at times Malaysia uses the sobriquet of Abang Besar or Abang Long, or, you know, the big brother of Asia, because looking at how, you know, the power is shifting towards China. So how can Australia work with ASEAN to ensure that, you know, external powers like China do not exploit divisions within the region while still fostering a stable and prosperous environment?
It's a good question because, to be frank, China has been quite successful, in my view, at exploiting divisions within ASEAN. ASEAN, as we know, depends very much on a consensus model, and when there's no consensus, ASEAN finds it difficult to take a position on issues. And so because there are differences of views of how to deal with China, but also on the South China Sea dispute within ASEAN itself, my view is that China has understandably used that to its advantage to deal with ASEAN, but prevent ASEAN from issuing any strong statements or taking a strong position against the Chinese activities. Yeah. Now, to answer your question, what can we do about that? Well, one suggestion, which I know will be perhaps heretical for a lot of ASEAN member states, is that consensus should be important, but it shouldn't be mandatory. So one of the roles that ASEAN has, and one of the great powers that ASEAN has, is the power to approve or sanction diplomatically. I'm not talking about using hard power or coercion, but diplomatically and morally, if you like. And I have often been frustrated that ASEAN has not been able to issue statements or positions because there hasn't been consensus. Now, consensus within ASEAN itself, I don't think is possible because countries have too many different interests. So my suggestion is that rather than make consensus a mandatory element, just like we've done with reforms in juries and court systems, perhaps a position of 9 out of 10 or could be sufficient, or 8 out of 10 could be sufficient for ASEAN to formally take a stance. Now, as I mentioned, I know this will be quite a heretical thing for an outsider to say about ASEAN, but my interest here is to ensure that ASEAN retains its relevance and role as tensions get deeper and deeper, particularly between the great powers. And if ASEAN cannot find a voice because it's insisting on consensus, my fear is that ASEAN gradually will lose its central diplomatic role. So I would like a central role for ASEAN. My argument is that ASEAN needs to modify a little bit to maintain that central diplomatic role, which it has played so successfully over many decades.
Dr. Lee, ASEAN has always remained neutral in terms of China-US rivalry, but how has ASEAN's approach to neutrality evolved or transformed since its inception, particularly in recent geopolitical tensions or shifts in Indo-Pacific? And what specific challenges has ASEAN's faced since the rise of China and US-China rivalry posed to ASEAN's stance towards neutrality?
In many respects, and although I'm born in Malaysia, I'm no longer Malaysian, I'm Australian, so I'm saying this as an outsider. But Southeast Asians and ASEAN have a very difficult situation because on the one hand, many Southeast Asians, well, 5 Southeast Asian claimant states essentially have differences with China. So from that point of view, there are Southeast Asian states that cannot remain neutral because they actually have interests. It doesn't mean they are confrontational, but they are not formally neutral because they have claims against other states, including China. But on the other hand, ASEAN, as you say, has to maintain a level of neutrality for it to become the accepted convener of discussion and strategic debate, and for great powers to accept ASEAN having that role. So my suggestion, I suppose, is that ASEAN can remain neutral in the sense that ASEAN can still become the organisation that brings the countries in dispute together, Southeast Asian countries and other countries. But ASEAN countries themselves cannot actually remain neutral. The last thing I would say, though, is that remaining neutral doesn't mean avoiding difficult issues. So I think for ASEAN to become more relevant rather than less relevant as strategic competition deepens in the region, the ASEAN forums, the East Asia Summit, for example, ASEAN +3, the ASEAN member states, and particularly the ASEAN chair, they do need to have the courage to put difficult issues on the agenda.
Yeah.
It may not be resolved, but not putting these issues on the agenda just drives them underground, and I think it actually makes tensions in the region even worse. So I'm hopeful next year and the year after that difficult issues, including the South China Sea, will be on the agenda, and I'd rather have the claimants argue it out at ASEAN Forum than seek to resolve it in their favour in other ways.
Okay.
Well, that has been a fascinating discussion with Dr. John Lee on ASEAN's role on the global economy and what lies ahead for the region. But we'll take a short break now and stay tuned with us at ASEAN Kita.
Di dalam setiap berita yang dibawa, konteks amat penting. Cara kita mendapat berita kian berubah. Melalui media sosial maupun saluran digital yang lain serta kaca TV. Kami sentiasa membawakan yang tergempar dan terkini.
Kita buat sesuatu yang berbeza.
Teraskan acuan verifikasi yang diamalkan supaya setiap fakta adalah sahih. Daripada analisis pelbagai sudut yang mendalam, laporan-laporan khas dan perbincangan yang membina negara. Inklusif, suara rakyat kami ajukan. Keseimbangan persepsi kami pastikan. Kerana setiap cerita mempunyai impak yang tersendiri dan perlu dibawa dengan penelitian yang terperinci. Pastikan Astro AWANI menjadi pilihan anda tidak kira di mana sahaja anda berada. Saluran berita paling dipercayai di Malaysia.
Kementerian Dalam Negeri memberi lampu hijau supaya pengesanan dadah dilakukan terhadap pengguna web.
Tahap integriti warga polis di Raja Malaysia PDRM masih membimbangkan walaupun peringatan dan amaran diberikan berulang kali.
Anwar menegaskan bahawa negara ini tidak mengiktiraf Israel secara de jure meskipun keberadaan negara itu di peringkat antarabangsa.
Malaysia tidak akan meminda peta sempadan maritim dan tetap mempertahankan kawasan dan kedaulatan negara di Laut Cina Selatan.
Bukan lagi rahsia.
Bang Aisyah curang dengan rakan sekerja dia, Pak.
I miss you, baby. Selama ni saya fikir saya dah gila benda memang betul awak curang ni. Your housewife dah gila. Dia serang saya kat lobi depan rumah.
Awak tahu tak apa yang awak buat hari ini dah tunjukkan dekat orang saya ni suami tak pandai nak didik isteri.
Sejauh manakah ketabahan Elina curang tanpa niat? Isnin hingga Khamis di Astro Ria dan Astro Go.
Hi, welcome back to ASEAN Kita. We have Dr. John Lee. We were discussing about Australia's role in the ASEAN region. Now let's dive back in with our question. Beyond, you mentioned forums just now. Beyond existing forums like the East Asia Summit and ASEAN Regional Forum, what new diplomatic initiative or mechanisms could ASEAN introduce to strengthen its role as an impartial mediator?
One possibility, I think, is that the 5 claimant states within ASEAN, under ASEAN approval, could get together and agree not on the actual territories, because they may not agree, but agree on at least the principles of how to prevent escalation between themselves, but also with China. And I would emphasize, preventing escalation doesn't mean backing down every time. Preventing escalation means that you come up with a series of
Solutions.
of behaviours and approaches. and something that goes beyond the code of conduct discussions that have been taking place between China and ASEAN for a long time with no resolution. It's more that there needs to be much more of a direct appeal to the Chinese, but also a direct, I could even use the word demand to the Chinese to agree to more reasonable measures. And to emphasise, ASEAN doesn't have any coercive power, but it does have the power of condemnation. And ASEAN should be prepared to use that if countries don't behave in ways that preserve stability.
Dr. Lee, given ASEAN's growing economic clout, how can the bloc use its collective economic weight to shape regional dynamics without affecting its or compromising its neutrality? And what specific economic initiatives or policies could reinforce ASEAN's position as, you know, a neutral yet influential player in the region?
I would say ASEAN as an economic zone undoubtedly has growing economic clout.
Sure.
But I wouldn't consider ASEAN a unified economic actor as such. But having said that, what ASEAN can do, and it's already doing this, is it can put forward important and practical visions for what the region needs. So, for example, ASEAN has a digital connectivity agenda.
Yeah.
Right? That's practical, but it's also meaningful. What I personally would like to see in that is ASEAN come up with some agreement amongst themselves as to what appropriate digital standards ought to be, what appropriate standards for data protection ought to be, and then engage more powerfully with the big players, United States, Europe, China, on trying to get these sorts of standards and regimes to become the norm. So I think as an economic zone or economic power, ASEAN, it's not a unified economic power, but it can set standards and rules if there's agreement amongst ASEAN states themselves. Now, that's a difficult conversation because if ASEAN did such a thing, the great powers would try to use its influence to influence, what direction ASEAN goes. But I think ASEAN has to stick to its positions. It has to, on these sorts of non-military strategic things, it has to remain unified and then present that unified front to the great powers.
Well, let's touch some contentious issues like, Palestine and Israel. How do you perceive Malaysia's obvious firm stance and Anwar's, Datuk Seri Anwar Ibrahim's vocal advocacy for Palestine's sovereign rights as a state affecting the dynamics within ASEAN, especially with countries like Singapore?
Yeah. Well, Malaysia is an Islamic state or Islamic majority state, so I do understand Malaysia's position on the Israel-Palestine issue. However, what I would say is that if religious or any other identity drives foreign policy too much, one should always remember that other member states don't necessarily share your identity. Sure. So the more outward or the more forward-leaning Malaysia is on this issue, there runs the risk that the more it is by itself or with a small number of other countries, it will become on this issue. Look, every country has a right to advocate for a position on any issue at once, but there's always a tension between going out on your own and trying to preserve an element of stability and harmony with your neighbours. So I think that balance needs to be considered in terms of any advocacy taken by Malaysia or otherwise on this issue.
Dr. Lee, as we approach ASEAN's 60th anniversary in 2027 and looking ahead to 2030, what potential geopolitical shifts, for example, the rise of India, technological disruptions, and also climate change impacts might significantly impact ASEAN's role, or they need to adapt to its approach to neutrality in order to remain relevant and effective in these possible scenarios, Dr. Lee?
One of the big threats I see happening is on the economic, supply chain and technological front. I mean, the height of ASEAN's influence and relevance, in my mind, was really the sort of 1990s and 2000s. And this was a time when geopolitics took a back seat. The world was starting to become more open, more globalized. The logic of economics overrode the logic of geopolitics and geostrategy. I think that world is fading. And therefore, ASEAN needs to adapt. And a specific example of this is that we can see already that there's not a hard decoupling going on between the West and China, but in a lot of technological areas, there is a decoupling occurring and it will accelerate. So ASEAN has to remain ahead of this. ASEAN has to look at what its position is on this kind of decoupling that's occurring, rather than pretending that it isn't occurring. Look, there will be situations where ASEAN, or at least member states, will essentially have to choose. And what I mean by that is they will have to choose, for example, which technological ecosystem they want to enter. And they don't, or because entering one means that you cannot enter another. I would prefer to see ASEAN be ahead of these issues, or at least think about their positions on these issues, think about the sort of principles they actually want to adhere to and the standards they want to uphold, and then choose accordingly. But they will have to choose.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lee. So that was Dr. John Lee, a senior fellow at the Huston Institute and a former senior advisor to the Australian Minister, sharing his insights and perspectives on ASEAN's evolving role and what the future lies ahead for the region. And I guess that's pretty much all that we have for today. Thank you for joining us. To our viewers, thank you for joining us today. I'm Amirul Aiman.
I am Farhan Hakimi. See you.